8-foot limbs glided through the dense thicket, breaking no branches and making no sound. Mark stared at the handheld thermal monitor, his breath hitching in his throat, creating a small cloud of steam that instantly froze in the frigid Yukon air. The digital display was grainy, a wash of grays and whites, but the heat signature was unmistakable. It was too tall to be a bear, too slender to be a moose, and it moved with a fluidity that defied the rugged, tangled terrain of the northern wilderness. It flowed between the trees like oil on water, a hot white smear against the cold black background of the forest. He lowered the device, blinking his eyes to clear the strain. The naked forest before him was a wall of impenetrable shadows. Without the thermal imaging, there was nothing but the oppressive silence of the tree line and the biting wind that rattled the hood of his parka. "Come on," Mark whispered to himself, his voice sounding thin and weak against the vastness of the woods. "Equipment glitch. It has to be." He was 3 miles from the main base camp, standing on a ridge overlooking Sector 4, the last known location of the vanished caribou herd. For 3 days, the telemetry data had been garbage, ghost signals, sudden drop-offs, and impossible speed readings. The project lead, Dr. Eris, had called it atmospheric interference and ordered everyone to stay within the perimeter until the satellite recalibrated. But Mark knew better. Atmospheric interference did not make 40 animals disappear from the face of the earth. He raised the thermal monocular again. The signature was still there, but now it had stopped. It was stationary, pulsating slightly on the screen, about 200 yards down the slope into the density of the old growth. It was the data point he needed. If he could get a visual confirmation, a photograph, or even a close-range scan, he could prove that something biological, a predator, a disease vector, something was disrupting the herd. It would save the project. It would justify the grant money that was currently burning a hole in the university's pocket. His radio crackled on his belt, the sudden static making him jump. He reached for the volume knob and turned it down, terrified that the sound would carry. Protocol dictated he check in every 30 minutes. He was 10 minutes overdue. If he turned back now, he'd face a reprimand, a warm coffee, and the gnawing knowledge that he had walked away from the answer. He looked at the slope. It was steep, choked with deadfall and frozen underbrush. A dangerous descent in the dark, even with a headlamp. But the heat signature flared again on his screen, brighter this time. It beckoned him. Just a quick look, Mark rationalized, the scientist in him shouting down the primal instinct that screamed at him to run the other way. I verify the source, I log the GPS coordinates, and I climb back up. He adjusted the strap of his heavy field pack, checked the battery level on his high-resolution camera, and took the first step off the ridge. The snow crunched loudly under his boots, a sound that seemed to echo for miles. He paused, waiting for a reaction from the forest. Nothing, just the wind. He began his descent, sliding slightly on the scree, moving toward the anomaly. With every step, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as if the forest itself was tightening its grip around him. He did not know it yet, but by crossing that ridge line, he had just stepped out of the natural world and into something far older. The descent was brutal. The underbrush snagged at his clothes like desperate hands, and the hidden roots threatened to twist his ankles with every step. Mark kept the thermal monocular pressed to his eye every few yards, correcting his course. The heat signature had not moved. It was waiting. As he closed the distance, the atmosphere shifted. The wind died down completely, leaving a vacuum of sound that was unnatural. In the wilderness, silence is never truly silent. There is always the rustle of pine needles, the distant hoot of an owl, the creaking of wood. But here, the silence was absolute. It was a sterile, manufactured quiet. Mark checked his GPS unit to mark a waypoint. The screen flickered. The arrow that usually indicated his heading was spinning lazily in a circle. The coordinates were scrambling, cycling through random numbers that placed him somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, then in Antarctica, then nowhere at all. Magnetic interference, he muttered, tapping the screen with a gloved finger. Great, just great. He looked up. He was close now. According to his last visual estimation, The anomaly should be just beyond a cluster of ancient spruce trees, their branches hanging low and heavy with moss. He unholstered his DSLR camera, removing the lens cap. He switched it to night sight mode, preparing to capture whatever was generating that heat. He crept forward, crouching low, trying to emulate the silence of the thing he had seen on the screen. He pushed aside a heavy, wet branch and peered into the clearing. The thermal monocular fell from his hand, dangling by its lanyard against his chest. There was nothing there. The clearing was empty. No animal, no machine, just a patch of disturbed snow and the looming trunks of the trees. Mark frowned, grabbing the thermal device again and scanning the area. The screen washed out with white noise for a second before stabilizing. The heat signature was gone. Impossible, Mark hissed. It was right here. He stepped into the clearing, confused and frustrated. He kicked at the snow. Then his boot hit something hard. He knelt, brushing away the powder. It was a caribou collar. Mark picked it up. It was heavy, the thick plastic casing cracked open. But it had not been gnawed on. There were no teeth marks, no signs of a struggle, no blood in the snow. The collar looked melted. The internal circuitry was fused together, a lump of blackened silicon and copper, as if it had been subjected to an intense, focused burst of microwave radiation. He turned the collar over in his hands. The plastic was smooth, but the destruction was absolute. This was not a wolf pack. This was not a poacher. A sudden, high-pitched whine pierced the air. A sound so high it was felt in the teeth more than heard with the ears. It was the sound of a capacitor charging, the whine of high-voltage electronics. Mark spun around, raising his camera. Through the viewfinder, he saw them. They were not hiding. They had simply stepped out from behind the trees as one. 3 of them. They were impossibly tall, their limbs elongated and thin, resembling the white birch trees that dotted the forest. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, stretching taut over skeletal frames. They had no faces, just smooth, indented surfaces where eyes and mouths should be. But it was the way they moved that shattered Mark's mind. They did not walk. They glided. Their legs did not bend at the knees in a human rhythm. They flowed forward, drifting over the uneven ground without bobbing up or down, their long arms trailing beside them like ribbons in water. Panic, cold and sharp, drove a spike into Mark's chest. He jammed his finger onto the shutter button of his camera. Click whir. The flash fired. The burst of light was blinding in the darkness. For a split second, the forest was illuminated in harsh blue-white. The instant the flash went off, the creatures stopped. They did not recoil. They did not flinch. They simply ceased movement instantly, defying inertia. The high-pitched whine escalated into a scream. The camera in Mark's hands grew hot, searingly hot. He yelped and dropped it into the snow. The lens shattered. The body of the camera began to smoke, the battery pack bulging and hissing. The creatures tilted their heads. Not at Mark, at the smoking camera in the snow. Then, slowly, in perfect unison, their faceless heads rotated toward him. Mark stumbled back, his boots catching on a root. He scrambled backward, his breath coming in jagged, terrified gasps. He needed to get out. He needed to run. He turned and sprinted back toward the slope, abandoning dignity, abandoning science. He crashed through the brush, no longer caring about the noise. Behind him, there were no footsteps, no breaking branches, just the rising hum of static electricity and the feeling of the air itself compressing. He risked a glance over his shoulder. They were closer. They had not run. They were simply closer. They were closing the distance with that nightmare glide, their long fingers reaching out, not to grab, but to touch. Mark's lungs burned. The slope was steeper than he remembered. He clawed at the frozen earth, pulling himself up. His smartwatch buzzed on his wrist. A notification, a reminder to breathe, a mockery of his situation. Bzzz, bzzz. The sound was tiny, but in the silence, it was a thunderclap. The creature nearest to him accelerated. It blurred, a streak of pale motion. It was not running. It was drawn. It was being pulled toward him. Mark scrambled over a fallen log, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He fumbled for the bear spray on his belt, ripping the safety clip off. He spun around, aiming the canister at the oncoming shape. "Back!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Get back!" He depressed the trigger. Nothing happened. No hiss of pressurized capsaicin. The nozzle sputtered and dripped a useless orange liquid. The pressure in the can was gone. The creature stopped 10 feet away. It loomed over him, 8 feet of impossible biology. Mark stared up at the blank face, waiting for the teeth, waiting for the claws. But the creature did not strike. It leaned down. Its long, fingerless hand reached out, hovering inches from Mark's chest. Mark squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the end. He felt a strange vibration in his chest. A heat. The creature's hand was not reaching for his heart. It was reaching for the GPS unit clipped to his parka strap. The screen of the GPS unit flared bright white, illuminating the creature's smooth, pale skin. The device shrieked a digital death rattle and then sparked violently. Mark felt the heat sear through his layers. He frantically unclipped the unit and threw it. The device sailed through the air, landing in a snowbank 5 yards away. The creature did not look at Mark. It turned its entire body, pivoting with mechanical precision, and moved toward the burning GPS unit. It hovered over the device as if inhaling the dying energy. Mark did not wait to see what happened next. He turned and scrambled up the ridge, his mind racing to catch up with what his eyes had seen. They were not hunting him. They were hunting the signal. He hid in the hollow beneath the upturned root system of a massive fallen hemlock. It was a tight, dirty hole, smelling of frozen mud and decay, but it offered cover. Mark curled into a ball, trying to control his shivering. He was trapped. He had seen 3 of them, but now he could sense more. The forest was alive with that subtle electric hum. It was a grid, and he was inside it. He tried to think. He was a scientist. He dealt in facts, in observable phenomena. Fact: the caribou collars were fried. Fact: the thermal camera attracted them. Fact: the flash of the DSLR made them target the device. Fact: the bear spray failed, likely because the propellant mechanism had been compromised by whatever field these things generated. Fact: the creature ignored his flesh to get to the GPS. "They not eating meat," Mark whispered, the realization dawning on him with the weight of a tombstone. They scrubbing the frequency. This was not predation. It was an immune response. The forest was ancient, silent, and deep. These things, whatever they were the white blood cells. And technology, the electromagnetic hum of the modern world, was the virus. The caribou had not been the target. The collars were. The animals were just collateral damage, attached to the foreign object that needed to be purged. Mark looked down at himself. He was a walking radio tower. He wore a Garmin GPS on his chest, now gone. He had a smartphone in his inner pocket, a digital watch on his wrist that tracked his heart rate and location, a high-frequency radio on his hip-to-contact base. Even his headlamp used a pulse-width modulation circuit to dim the LED. He was the brightest thing in the woods. He reached for his radio. If he could just get a distress signal out, maybe they could send a helicopter. A chopper with a searchlight. His hand froze on the dial. A helicopter. A massive, loud, electromagnetic storm of an engine. If he called it in, he would not be saving himself. He would be summoning a feast. They would tear it out of the sky. And if he turned the radio on to transmit, Mark looked through the gaps in the roots. The forest was dark, but he could see faint, rhythmic pulses of light in the distance. They were searching, scanning. He slowly pulled the radio from his belt. The power light was blinking a slow, steady red. Standby mode. Even in standby, it was emitting a faint signal. A shadow fell over the entrance to his burrow. Mark stopped breathing. A long, pale limb reached down, brushing against the root structure. It was so close Mark could see the texture of the skin. It looked like bleached parchment. The creature paused, tilted its head, could sense the standby current. Mark's hand trembled. If he turned it off, the click might give him away. If he left it on, the signal would draw them in. The creature lowered itself, crouching. It had no eyes, but the indentation on its face was pointed directly at Mark's hip. Mark realized with a sickening jolt that he had no weapon. He had no defense. He was fighting a fundamental force of this environment with tools that only made him more vulnerable. He was trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The creature's hand drifted closer to the opening. It was testing the air, tasting the electromagnetic field. Mark knew he had seconds. He looked at the radio, then at his watch, then at the bulge of the phone in his pocket. He was going to die here. He was going to die because he was connected. A calm, cold clarity washed over him. It was the clarity of the prey that stops running and turns to face the teeth. But Mark was not going to fight. He was going to evolve. Slowly, with agonizing care, Mark unzipped his parka. The sound of the zipper was a harsh rasp. The creature froze. His hand twitched, fingers splaying out. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. The screen lit up as he touched it. A bright, glaring beacon of notification icons and searching bars. The creature hissed. It was a sound like a high-tension cable snapping. It reeled back slightly, confused by the sudden spike in radiation. Mark did not hesitate. He pulled the radio from his belt. He ripped the digital watch from his wrist. He grabbed the spare battery pack for his headlamp from his pocket. He bundled them all together in the snow in front of him. A pile of lithium and circuits. He tapped the screen of the phone. Flashlight on. Max brightness. He twisted the volume knob of the radio. Static roar. He set the watch alarm. Beep, beep, beep. The noise and light were blinding, deafening in the confined space. The creature shrieked. A sound of pure, mechanical hunger. Mark shoved the pile of electronics out of the hole, pushing it as far as he could into the open clearing. Then he rolled. He rolled deeper into the hollow, forcing himself into the mud, jamming his body into the tightest crevice of the roots, putting the mass of the dead tree between him and the bait. Outside, the forest exploded. It sounded like a car wreck in a thunderstorm. There was the crunch of plastic, the popping of batteries, the sizzle of frying circuits. The blue light of arching electricity flashed wildly, casting chaotic shadows into Mark's hiding place. He heard more of them coming. The ground vibrated with their arrival. They swarmed the pile of gear, tearing at it, absorbing the energy, crushing the sources of the signal. Mark pressed his face into the freezing mud. He squeezed his eyes shut. He held his breath until his lungs screamed. He waited for the claws. He waited for them to realize that the meat was still nearby. But the violence was focused entirely on the machines. The screeching and tearing continued for a minute, then two, and then the electronic sounds died. The static ceased. The light faded. Silence returned. Mark lay there for an hour, maybe two. The cold seeped into his bones, numbing his fingers and toes. He could not check the time. He had no watch. He could not check his location. He had no GPS. He was completely, utterly disconnected. When he finally moved, he did not stand up. He did not walk. He crawled. He pulled himself out of the back of the root hollow, dragging his belly across the snow and ice. He kept his head down, eyes fixed on the ground. He navigated by the slope of the land. Water flows down. The river was at the bottom of the valley. If he found the river, he could follow it to the bridge. Mark moved like an animal. He felt the texture of the snow, the bite of the wind. He listened to the true sounds of the forest, the creak of the timber, the wind in the needles. He saw them one more time. About halfway down the slope, he froze. 100 yards to his left, 3 of the pale giants were standing in a circle around a solar-powered weather station that the university had set up months ago. They were motionless, like statues, their hands resting on the solar panels, draining them, neutralizing them. They looked peaceful. Gardeners tending to weeds. Mark did not panic. He did not run. He had no signal to give him away. To them, he was just biological matter. He was just a badger or a deer or a falling leaf. He was part of the silence now. He crawled past them. He moved with the wind. He breathed with the rhythm of the trees. Took him 6 hours to reach the riverbank. The sun was beginning to crest the horizon, painting the sky in pale purples and grays. Mark stood up, his legs shaking uncontrollably. He was covered in mud and pine pitch. His hands were raw and bleeding. He looked down the river. In the distance, the steel structure of the logging bridge was visible. He began to walk toward it. As he reached the gravel road, a truck appeared. It was a logger, heading out for the morning shift. The driver saw Mark, a wild, ragged figure stumbling out of the tree line, and slammed on the brakes. The man jumped out, rushing over to Mark. "Holy hell, buddy, are you okay? You look like you went through a meat grinder." Mark could not speak. His throat was frozen. He just nodded, collapsing onto the gravel. "Here," the driver said, reaching into his pocket. "Let me call for help." He pulled out a satellite phone. He extended the antenna. "I'll get the Rangers." Mark's eyes widened. He saw the black plastic of the phone. He saw the small green light blink on as it searched for a signal. The fear that gripped him was not the fear of the forest. It was the fear of the beacon. "No!" Mark rasped, his voice a ruined croak. He lunged forward, slapping the phone out of the driver's hand, clattered onto the stones. The driver stepped back, hands raised, eyes wide. "Whoa, easy. I'm trying to help you." Mark stared at the phone lying on the ground. He looked back at the tree line. The forest was still, but he knew they were there, watching, listening for the hum. "Do not," Mark whispered, backing away from the device, backing away from the truck. "Do not turn it on, please." He looked at the driver, his eyes wild and ancient. "They can hear the future," Mark said, trembling, "and they want to take it back."